So the question is, how reliable are polls? And the answer is, typically, most polls are pretty darn reliable. They use scientific methods to get samples. They have good question wording, and therefore they are believable. However, it's possible if you have a sample that's done by a firm that's not very careful, that you could get something that's not very reliable. One thing to always look for is, what's the sample size? Bigger sample sizes are better, but 1,000 is plenty. It doesn't have to be enormous. The other thing to look at carefully, and probably most importantly, is the question wording. And find out how the question was asked, because there are ways to ask questions to get the answers you want. So you want to make sure that the polling firm has asked it in a way that looks pretty neutral. So you don't want to have a question that says, essentially, when did you stop beating your wife? It's got to, and you don't want something that says, when did you decide that you didn't like this candidate? That would be a bad question. It should say, what do you like about the candidate? What do you dislike about the candidate? Well, there's two things that polling can do that are really important. One is, it often helps communicate to policymakers attitudes of everybody in the public, because they're public samples. They're not just the groups that policymaker typically talks to. And especially that's important right now when we have such a money-fueled election process that we don't have a situation in which the people who are our policymakers, our politicians, are just talking to rich people, for example, because they've got the money. You want to make sure that they hear what the run-of-the-mill average person thinks about things, and polls are great at giving us that kind of information. The second thing polling can do, especially in the horse race aspects, that is to say, in telling us who's ahead and who's behind, say, in the primaries, is they can actually signal to us, gosh, why is it that that particular person looks like he or she is becoming more or less popular? And that can make us think, what's going on there? And hopefully that lets us, or makes us, go and listen to news reports and find out what's going on. If, however, we just look at those polls and say, well, I'm going to look at the person who's ahead and assume that's the best candidate, that's probably not a good way to go. So the user of polls has to be a good consumer, has to think about what was the question, what was the sample, and what was the reason why somebody is ahead in the polls or behind in the polls. Well, this is to some extent the bane of survey researchers, is that things have become really hard to do in terms of getting people to respond to polling. So I would urge anybody watching this, please respond to pollsters. It used to be we could do in-person interviews fairly cheaply, and we would get 70, 80, 90% response rates, which are pretty good. Then we went to telephones, and we still did pretty well, 70, 80, 90% response rates. That was 40 years ago. Now telephone response rates for a lot of media polls are down in the 10% range. That means 1 out of 10 people respond. This has caused a lot of people to be really worried about that. But it turns out, really rather remarkably, that it still seems as if we get a pretty random group of people, even though only 1 out of 10 people respond. Still, it is worrisome. Furthermore, now we're going increasingly to internet samples. And one of the worries about internet samples is it's only people who are on the internet, and not everybody's on the internet. So you've got to be especially careful of internet samples and make sure you don't have a situation where you have just a self-selected internet sample, that it's a firm or a group that's really thought hard about how to adjust for the fact that people on the internet might be different than people not on the internet. What's the role of social media? That's a good question. I think social media are really quite remarkable. It's a new thing. And likes, for example, on Facebook pages, you can use as one measure about whether somebody's popular. Because as you know, you can go to a Facebook page of a candidate and you can say you like that candidate, and then that gets counted up, and then you can say this person has 1 million likes. And so, for example, Dick Cheney has a very low number of likes, which some people have said, well, that means that Dick Cheney wasn't very popular. And that may be so. And other people have 1 million likes, like Obama's got a lot of likes out there. I think it's interesting, and I think it tells us something about the candidate. We have to be careful that sometimes a like might be because of some peculiar feature of that candidate. It might be, well, this is a real great oddity, and it's a peculiar person, but nevertheless I sort of like him or her. And that may not be enough to really judge that the person is really a good candidate for public office. The social media, to be truthful, are really changing the way we think about information. And we're still trying to understand how to interpret a lot of what goes on. What does it mean to have tweets retweeted? What does it mean to have likes on Facebook pages? We're not sure what all that means yet. We're trying to understand it. One of the biggest issues that face pollsters is to make sure you get really good samples, especially of lower income people. I mean, this is where, for example, internet samples are problematic, because it turns out there's a big class gradient lower income people are less likely to be on the internet. Big surprise. They're less likely to have computers and internet connections. And therefore, if you're using internet samples in polling, you're more likely to get upper class people, and that'll obviously create a bias in the sample that you've got. So good pollsters work very, very hard to make sure they have a good sample of lower income people. And there have been ways that have been developed to have internet samples that actually do that by having lots of people sign up and opt in, and then trying to look for low income people amongst those folks, and then make sure you overweight some of the low-income people you have. That is to say, have more of them in your poll than you might otherwise get, and make sure that you actually have a representative sample. A lot of what we do is whenever we do a good survey, we ask a bunch of questions about people's socio-demographic characteristics, we call it. What age are they? What income are they? What education are they? And we try to then look after the fact and make sure that the people who have answered our poll are representative of what we know from the Census Bureau is a representative sample of the United States. Yeah, I'm not sure there's a role of polling with respect to getting young people out there, and it's really important to not, I think, just describe it as young person's apathy. I think what's really important to know about voting especially is it's a habitual behavior. Once you've done it once, you tend to do it again. And so one of the tricks here is to get young people to vote early. So it's very important to have schools, for example, both high schools when kids are attaining the age of 18, and certainly colleges work hard to enroll people, to register them, and to get them voting. Another problem with voting is that you got to be registered to vote. And young people are notoriously mobile. They're notoriously let us say, not always focused on getting important bureaucratic things done like registering. And so to make that easy for young people would be very helpful. And we know that once we get them enrolled in the voting rolls, registered, and once they vote once, we know they'll probably vote again and again and again. So the trick here is to find ways to actually get them registered.